Today we're plagued by visions. You know what? Fuck it. Let's just get into it. Hi, and welcome to another installment of Plagued by Visions, where we explore literature that'll make you ask yourself, was it even worth it? My name is Juan, and today I am reviewing what a lot of you viewers and book lovers, plunderers of the disturbing and sick and deranged have named as one of the most depraved, nastiest, most harrowing and disturbing books ever written, The Big Head by Edward Lee. So I read this book as a buddy read with Timmy. Now, maybe some of you don't know who Timmy is, but if you are a content creator here in the horror corners of BookTube, chances are you know who Timmy is. I mean, Timmy, he just is this amazing, loved presence around these parts. We all love Timmy. We stand Timmy. Yeah, I read this along with him. I'm actually not sure as of the moment that I'm recording this, I'm not sure if he's done with it, but he was pretty close. Such a riveting fucking book that I just had to finish it sooner than later. So Timmy, I don't know if you're still reading this, but I await a more in-depth discussion between you and I. But in case you are watching this video already, I want to say this video is dedicated to you. And thank you for reading this with me, and I'm so sorry. So yeah, The Big Head by Edward Lee. Edward Lee is a sort of well-known name in the horror community, I guess, as well known as other names like Brian Keene or Richard Lehman. I mean, he was one of those leisure paperback authors, and he wrote quite a few novels. Well, I think he's still writing actually, and I did read one of his previously for one of my themed months back in July, and you may not recall my review of that because it wasn't really much of a review. I simply said I read it, I thought it was a terrible book, but the writing in it was compelling and entertaining enough that I still managed to finish it up, and it was like 300 and something pages, and I still went through it just because it was just such a bad, ill-conceived story, and the sort of foundation of it as a novel was just so flawed. But I just couldn't stop reading it, and I think I gave it 1 star. But I said, you know what? This is one of the rare instances, in fact, maybe the only instance in which I would actually recommend that you read a book that I rated 1 star, just because it was something, man. It was something. And by the way, that book was Slither. So this is my second time reading a book by Edward Lee. And here on BookTube, one of my viewers and a strong supporter of the horror BookTube community, Toby, who you can always find down in the comments, supporting the channel like the king he is. Toby, I think, really likes Edward Lee. Edward Lee has this white trash gothic series. We're gonna get into that, don't worry. But he's a fan of Edward Lee's work, and I think he mentioned this. I don't know if he recommended it to me, but he definitely said it was one of the nastier ones that he's ever read. And Toby's like a extreme horror connoisseur, so I trust Toby's opinions on the matter. And if Toby said this one was super nasty, I just had to read it, and I think that recommendation was also seconded by Joshua from Coffee Cats and King, who also said this is a sick, deranged book, and it just pulls no punches, and you have to read it if you are a fan of disturbing, disgusting, transgressive literature. So of course, everybody, all this buzz going on, of course I had to read the fucking thing, right? And again, was happy to have Timmy join me in this journey of torture and depravity. So I was not in it alone. And so yeah, I've read it, and I feel like I can't just jump into a review of The Big Head by Edward Lee without just kind of trying to say something like, let me explain. So this book, as you can imagine, has everything. It just every trigger, every transgressive aspect, every edge of atrocity and depravity and monstrousness and just everything you can imagine, like sexual assault, maiming, all kinds of bodily torture, psychological torture, blasphemy abounds in the pages, and that's just kind of scratching the surface. So of course, as you can imagine, if you are sensitive to any of those kinds of things, I don't think you're gonna like this one. But for those people who don't necessarily mind those things, I don't know if you like it either. I mean, it's honestly, it's hard to explain. It's one of those books. Like when I was reviewing Flesh by Richard Lehman, I ran into similar sort of mental pitfalls where I'm just like, where do I even start? What do I even say? Was it the most disturbing thing I've ever read? No. And well, I guess that's a good place to start. Yes, this is, I would say perhaps, yes, one of the most graphic books that I have ever read. I think I will agree on that. And it's just constant, relentless depictions of all the things I already mentioned. I won't go too much into detail, but you can imagine, right? I mean, the kind of usual fodder that we see in extreme horror. I mean, sort of rape is just like a constant thing, and then followed by, murder, and then followed by maiming, and then followed by more rape, and then followed by all kinds of things. And yes, that is one of the big topics that arises out of this, because most of the critiques that a book like this might be inclined to receive is that it's just misogynist trash, right? Like it's just constant, seemingly titillating or depictions of sexual assault that are meant to titillate, that are meant to just be a display of shallow debauchery that's meant to sort of appease that sort of aggro, monstrous demand that we have for seeing constant violent depictions of assaults against women, against children, against other men, etc. Certainly, those are things that I have spoken about in the past. That some of it I am sensitive to. There are things that I will not read, but it just depends. To me, the big factor depends on how it's written and the purpose behind such writing, and how the author goes about depicting such terrible things, right? So I, of course, I think, as most people, I'm an advocate for free speech, and I think that books like this are important just in terms of continuing to push that envelope, continuing to demand that there should be no stops to art, to fiction, to expression, definitely. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it should be free from scrutiny. And if you want to read it from that angle, and if you want to criticize the contents of this book from that angle, of course you are free to do so. In fact, just by the nature of the subject matter, it sort of invites that kind of critique. I think critiques like that are certainly valid. But to me, this book was just hilarious. I don't know. It's just, and I don't think it's just me. I think Edward Lee is genuinely writing humor into what he's depicting here. And then, of course, you're going to raise your eyebrows and sort of think, why do you find such things funny? Well, it's not that I find the actual subject matter funny. It's just the way it's depicted is so baffling. It's so bewildering. I just cannot imagine somebody writing this with a straight face. And it's just the constant sort of unloading of just any wild thing that comes into mind. The big thing that sort of rose into my mind as I was reading this, in regards to humor, in regards to that sort of relentless depiction of catastrophe and atrocity, it's something akin to an Aristocrats joke. If you're not familiar with what an Aristocrats joke, I think there's an entire film based on that joke that is just famous comedians telling their own version of it. Basically, the joke is that there's a family man who is going up to a sort of a theater producer and is pitching his play, which is, the producer asks him, well, what is the play? What's the script? What is the series of events that's depicted? And then he goes, okay, so the show starts like this. And then they go on to rattle off all kinds of fucking terrible things, like, you know, in the first act there's incest, in the second act emissions of liquids and playing around with poop and blah blah blah, and it goes on and on. You can make it as long and depraved as you possibly can, and then at the end the producer asks the dad, well, you know, that's interesting, so what's the play called? And then the dad says, the Aristocrats. And that's the punchline. I think it's just meant to be this absurdist sort of non-conclusion to all the debauchery that was rattled off, for the sake of humor, for the sake of that contrast. And I think contrast is something that's big in a book like this. It's just every possible form of swapping of body fluids and viscera and every single atrocity that mankind can think of, but the delivery of it is what sort of recenters it, situates it in a sort of space of comedy. That's really what I took away from it. If you don't necessarily laugh at this book, you'll certainly find it bizarre as hell, sort of surreal, and just leave you scratching your head, and it'll certainly make you go, what? Like that kind of thing, you know? Maybe laughing as a way to protect yourself, or maybe just laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. I don't know. But I do think it's valid to say something like that, you know, because I think things like that do have a space in entertainment in one way or another, and they certainly have a space in literature. And that's where I sort of want to get into the literary parallels that I saw while reading this in regards to other things that I've read. So of course, I think one of the big ones is actually not literature. It's a music piece. It's a song by a transgressive artist back in the 80s, Karen Finley. And the song is called Tales of Taboo. And it's a song that just, I'll link it in the description if you want to listen to it. It's just her, I feel, sort of improvising every single depravity that comes to her mind, sexual or otherwise, but mostly sexual. And that is a form of, like I said, transgressive art, some way to push boundaries. And I think that there is something akin to a political statement that's being mobilized in The Big Head. And I just realized I haven't even told you what it's about. Well, without giving too much away, it takes place in, where does this take place? Virginia, the Virginia backwoods. So this is a Southern horror novel, and I will get into that too. But so this takes place in this small town out in the backwoods that's been ravaged by poverty, and it follows these two women. One of them is going back to the small town that is her hometown that she hasn't been in for decades, and then the other one is a journalist who is going there to write a piece on, you know, the area, the history of it, blah blah blah. And then that's one of the threads. And then another thread follows a priest who's been assigned to an abbey that's in this town. He's been assigned to reconstruct it, refurbish it, and make it into a hospice for old dying priests. And that's his journey. Father Alexander is his name. And then another thread is Aunt Annie, who is Christie's aunt, the girl that's coming back to her hometown. The journalist's name is Jerica. Sorry, I'm a bit of a mess trying to explain The Big Head. You can imagine why. And then the other thread is, of course, The Big Head. This burgeoning monstrous being with a dick that's like a foot long. I'm not making that up. That is explained in here quite a couple of times. He has a big schlong, and inwardly tells you The Big Head is a double entendre, because he really has like this big bulbous head, but it could also mean, like, you know what I mean. And it follows his journey. At first, he is just sort of going on a path of murder and rape and mayhem, but eventually he's going to cross paths with these other people in a variety of interesting supernatural and horrific ways, as you can imagine. And then the other final thread that we have in the story is the journey of Dick and Balls. Two characters, and their names are Dick and Balls. 5 stars. And they're just sort of driving around killing anybody that crosses their path for no reason. They're just bored. So there's that. So yeah, that's the plot of The Big Head, and in a sense, there are some interesting takes in here with regards to poverty in the South. Definitely, that sort of blighted culture, ravaged by a lack of resources, sort of stunted and driven only by this violent impulses and dark psychology that sort of prevails in the barren landscape. There's something interesting that Edward Lee is doing there, for sure, I would say. And also, again, with the humor, with the depravity, it's just sort of building everything up to be this big scandal. It's a scandalous novel. I think scandal is the key word with trying to understand something like The Big Head. And that brings me to the other comparison that I want to make with this novel, is that like I said, it's a Southern novel. I would call this Southern Gothic extreme horror, 100%. And it even draws into older traditions of Gothic literature. I will say that with 100% conviction. You might be sort of rolling your eyes and thinking Juan's gone crazy, but I stand by that statement. I think Edward Lee is not nearly as stupid as one might be inclined to think after reading one or a couple of his books. I think he really is a man who understands narrative dynamics in a traditional sense, and I think that is evident in here because he has truly written a Gothic novel in that older sort of 18th century tradition. When I was reading this, and I was just reading the jumbled mess of events that unfold, when I was reading this sort of this constant concern with blurred and obfuscated and confused bloodlines. And it's also this tale about supernatural apparitions and sort of celestial and heavenly religious revelations that take on, sort of a conflation of the holy and the secular, sort of converge and happen at the same time. And it's sort of extracting heavenly concerns and implanting them into this earthly depraved context. I mean, those are all literary traditions and tropes that you find in 18th century Gothic literature. And the book that I was reminded of most while reading The Big Head, believe it or not, was The Monk by Matthew Lewis. This was published in 1796. And I gotta tell you, it's a similar length to The Big Head, and it is just as messy. And for its time, in the time that it was written, it's just as scandalous, it's just as depraved, it's just as just confusing, head-scratching debauchery and depravity and atrocity. And that's just kind of what it is. And it's meant to be something that's supposed to draw an emotional reaction out of its reader. I mean, it's really kind of the birth of the emotional novel and the Gothic novel. And it's meant to rise your feelings. It's meant to, flush you with shame or indignance or just move you in some kind of way, usually a negative emotional reaction, is what Gothic literature was trying to draw out of its readers. And really, it was just kind of this constant battle of authors trying to outdo each other with how far they could push circumstances and the suspension of disbelief and so forth. That is what I see here. To me, this is like a masterfully written, modern Gothic novel told in the original tradition to a T. And that's just what it is to me. And it's depraved. It at some points reads even like erotica. I think Timmy said, Edward Lee would make a killer living writing erotica if he didn't write horror, and I 100% agree. I mean, there's a lot of long passages about the birds and the bees, and it's meant to be scandalous and raunchy like a Gothic novel. And I mean, how do you do scandalous and raunchy in the 90s when this was published, when everything's already been done? Well, you push the envelope. You you go further than anybody has ever dared to go in order to draw that rush of emotion and indignance out of your readers, which is really what Edward Lee is trying to do here. And that's one of the reasons why, semi-spoilers, I'm not going to say what happens at the end, but I will say it's a jumbled and confused mess where everything just sort of happens. But that's what most novels were like in the 18th century and early 19th century, especially Gothic novels. So I'm used to that mode of storytelling, which is why I didn't mind it that much. And again, it's depraved. Yes, it's monstrous. It's obscene beyond belief. But it's kind of done in a humorous... I mean, there's things in here that I just don't believe can be written without the author's tongue being at least somewhere in close proximity to his cheek. You know what I mean? It's just too much, and I think, like I said, Edward Lee seems to be very self-aware of what he's writing here. Now, there were definitely a lot of problems. In fact, I think mostly they have to do with syntax. And there were a lot of, well, not a lot, but more than a handful of grammar mistakes in here. And this was published in like 1998, so it's been long enough that somebody should just come here and fix that up. So, you know, definitely those did take me out. And also, so a lot of the passages are told, you know, they're phonetically written out as, you know, with that southern drawl at some moments, but then when we have the passages of like the city girls who speak normal quote unquote English, they're written in regular English. Now I have to say, Edward Lee trying to do a juggling act between writing some passages in that southern drawl, in that phonetic southern drawl, and then jumping back into the formal English. He did drop the ball a couple of times. Sometimes he wrote some passages that were supposed to be in formal English in the phonetics, southern drawl, and sometimes he did the mistake, you know, vice versa. So definitely a lot of problems with the narrative voice. And again, I think it's a pretty lengthy novel, and I gotta say, something like The Big Hits, something that everybody was like, extreme fucking horror, non-stop violence, like you would think it would be that, but The Big Head was surprisingly a super slow burn. Go figure. It just moved so, like, the actual plot, you get glimpses of the Big Head doing big head things now and then. You know, he'll go and bonk somebody in the head and then eat their brains, and they taste a little bit like cheese, is what he said, like very salty. He likes some brains more than others. I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, but you know, you get a passage told from the Big Head's point of view, and then it's like 30 pages of people looking up old church documents and talking about their own interiority, again, like a Gothic novel. There's so much interiority here about confused and, you know, frail thoughts of sex and one's place in the proper societies and whatnot. You know, very Matthew Lewis, very Matthew Lewis. I know I keep saying that, but same shit, sister. Honestly. Yeah, it's very slow, and that did sort of take me out of it. Where I was like, okay, can we get this show rolling? Like, where's the Big Head? Like, the Big Head 100% was my favorite character. I was like, I want to know what the Big Head's doing. I really don't care about Jerica and Christy and what the fuck they're doing in their bedroom. I don't care. But you know, there are some commendable things about it. I think the depiction of Jerica and Christy, the city girls, is done in a very sensible way. I mean, you get so much debauchery and violence against women throughout the book, but then you get these very sensible and real depictions of the inner struggles of women and their place in the city and their place in the workplace, and their sort of self-image as a result of this constant sort of ogling and objectification at the hands of men. There is an awareness of that sort of thematic thread of what Edward Lee is doing something in here. You know, he objectifies women purposefully in order to up the shock, but then he tells you, you know, there's still a steady humanity running throughout here. And the two make a sort of very jarring pair, but at the same time, it's very interesting that contrast draws so many thought-provoking sort of observations about the way that women are depicted in certain genres, such as horror. So definitely there was something there that I thought was provocative and suggestive enough to merit, you know, some, you know, plus points. But also, you know, I think there's also, it falls into these pitfalls of It's the man who saves the day, like the priest, Father Alexander, who I didn't like at all. I thought he was just a douchebag, but whatever. Some of the story sort of amps up to an explosive conclusion. I'm not going to spoil whether or not it gets there, but a lot of the action sort of felt a bit stunted. It just comes in spurts, and then it draws back, and then it comes in a few more spurts, and that rhythm was a little bit jarring and not necessarily to my taste in a lot of ways. I did sort of fall into a slump halfway through, but I pulled through because I was like, you know what, I'm invested enough in knowing what the fuck the big head's gonna do. And I'm kind of rooting for the guy at this point. Yeah, honestly, it wasn't bad at all. It was, like I said, it's not the most disturbing thing that I've ever read, mostly because for a book to disturb me, it has to have a certain kind of refinement in terms of how violence is depicted or how psychological torment is depicted. And refinement is not something that Edward Lee is seeking to do. And I understand that. I respect that. So I didn't approach it with that, lens. But like I said, because of that, it's not really the most disturbing thing I've ever read. And the constant depictions of extreme violence were just more comical to me, because I guess I'm just a little more desensitized to newcomers to extreme horror. I can definitely see this rattling their brains, but for me it was just like no, not really, but I didn't expect it to. It's just graphic depictions of violence don't really hold that kind of spell over me, and I look for other things to sort of enjoy my time or get something worthwhile out of my reading. And like I said, I did find them here. They were there. Edward Lee did lay them out there with his surprising take on a Southern Gothic, traditional slow burn, which was surprisingly nice to read. So overall, I think I give The Big Head 3 stars out of 5. It wasn't terrible to me. I understood where it was coming from. I understood the sort of writing lineage that it was making allusions to. Like I said, there were some thought-provoking things here in terms of the grammar and the syntax and the narrative voice and the pacing. We did have some problems, but that's usually the case with works like this, right? And it's up to personal taste. And like I said, yeah, there's a lot in here that is sure to rattle some readers. But if you're not easily rattled like me, I think you'll still find something compelling and worthwhile, hopefully. So I give it 3 stars because if you're into this kind of literature, I'd say I do recommend it. Like, give it a shot. Maybe you'll find things in here that you'll enjoy. Maybe you won't. Who knows? But yeah, The Big Head by Edward Lee. Coming down from his other novel, Slither, I was like, what am I getting myself into? But I was pleasantly surprised. So there's my review of The Big Head. I'm definitely very interested in continuing the conversation around this book with other people who might have read it. Sound off in the comments, or if you plan to read it, let me know. If you've read anything else by Edward Lee, let me know. Like I said, he does have like this white trash gothic series, I think it's called. So the word Gothic keeps popping up in reference to his name. Again, more evidence that points me to the fact that he really does try to write in this tradition. I think he does like sort of Lovecraftian weird tales as well. Very interesting guy, and very interesting choice, like mode of writing, and very interesting set of inspirations that I suspect that he has. But yeah, that was The Big Head, one of the most infamous horror novels, extreme horror novels ever written. I'm glad that I didn't entirely hate it. I'm glad that there were some things in it that I liked. Extreme horror has been kind of hit and miss for me, if I'm being honest. You saw I read Talia by Daniel Volpe, and it wasn't really my cup of tea. There's a couple of other extreme horror works that I am preparing to read. I think the next one I'm going to read is The Slob by Aaron Beauregard. Again, Toby, the authority on extreme horror right here on Plagued by Visions, recommended this. And I'm going to be buddy reading this with Blackacre Doe, I believe. So that should be fun. I also buddy read Talia with him, and didn't go as well as we'd hoped. But we've heard good things about this one, so we're hopeful. If any of you have any more suggestions about extreme horror, like I said, what I'm looking for. It's some extreme horror with a little something else, a little a little kick of something else to keep me, entertained. It's just constant depictions of violence over and over. I don't judge the people that like that. Obviously, I don't judge anybody's on their reading taste. But for me, I do need a little something else. I do need a little something else to tether me, to keep me intrigued, to keep me reading for more. And like I said, the Big Hit did have things like this. I am not going to be holding on to my copy of the Big Hit. I am happy I read it, but I do not mind parting with it. And I'm actually going to be sending this off to another booktuber, Josh from Working Man Reads. I think he'll enjoy it. I think he'll be happy to read this. Hopefully, if he hates it, then I'm sorry, but yeah, I'm sending this off. This is going to be his business now. But yeah, again, extreme horror suggestions in the comments. If you've read the Big Hit, let's talk about it. Looking forward to those conversations if they happen. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I don't know what that could have been, but I hope you learned it. And yeah, I hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe and watch out for the big head, because he has a big head.